Hey friend, hit subscribe. Takes you a second, but it means the world to me. And please leave a comment on the Revenge Veil channel telling us which city you're watching this story from. That really helps the channel grow. Thank you. Now back to the story. Paper envelope on the kitchen table looked like a verdict. It was ordinary, tucked between the salt shaker and a stack of unpaid bills, and that ordinariness made the blow sharper. Everyday things beside betrayal. The light over the table threw a yellow pool that made the printed words look official, though I knew they were a lie. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 52. In the space of 2 months I lost both my parents, and the house where I grew up felt like the last piece of them I could still touch. Daniel, my brother, arrived at noon with that envelope, and that is how it began. Daniel, my brother, said, "Maggie, it's time we close this chapter." I replied, "Close? You can't just throw me out of the house I grew up in." Daniel, my brother, said, "Dad left everything to me. The lawyer has the papers. It'll be easier this way." His voice was calm, like he was asking to move furniture, not taking a life. Laura, his wife, stood in the doorway in summer sandals, watching like someone choosing curtains. She had that confidence people carry when they believe a sheet of paper can solve a wound. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't a fight. It was quiet, the kind of silence that kills slowly and convincingly. I watched him walk through rooms, open drawers, as if the inventory list had already been written. My childhood things, my father's battered books, framed family photos, suddenly they looked like items to be sorted. That night I slept on the living room couch with a scrap of paper in my wallet, a line my father had said to me a few weeks earlier in his study. "Margaret, I want the house to come to you." I kept that scrap like a talisman, not knowing then that a talisman would become evidence. In the morning I drove to a motel with a tiny suitcase and my mother's rosary in my pocket. The motel smelled of cleaner and burnt coffee, and I told myself it would be temporary. We'd sit down, talk, fix this. There was no talk. An hour later Laura posted photos from the evening in the house. Candles, plates, smiling faces. Her caption read, "New beginnings." The screen showed everything and nothing at once. I called Ethan Price. Ethan Price, the lawyer whom my father had recommended years ago, answered in that low, careful voice. "Margaret, what's happened?" I replied, "Daniel brought a letter. He says there's a will. Dad told me something different." Ethan Price, the lawyer, asked, "Were you present at any signing?" I replied, "No. He spoke to me. He told me the house should be mine." His pause was brief. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "I'll request the original from the county clerk. If you have anything, notes, witnesses, receipts, keep them. Estates like this get contested more than people expect." 2 days later I held a photocopy of the county file in my hands. My father's hand, his punctuation, his voice across ink. Everything was there. The will named me as the primary beneficiary of the property, and a sizable share of liquid assets. I photographed the pages and sent them to Ethan. When I called Daniel he picked up and then went quiet. "Daniel," my brother said over the phone, "it's a misunderstanding. We could handle this quietly." I replied, "What misunderstanding? There's an official will in the county archive." He tried to soften it. "Think about taxes, upkeep, Maggie. The house is a burden." I replied, "A burden? You used to come here every Sunday for Mom's stew." I wanted to believe it was a family mistake. That knot in my chest didn't loosen. Ethan dug in. He pulled records, contacted the clerk, and told me there was a second document. A will that surfaced after the funeral. Its signature didn't match my father's. Forensic handwriting examiners put the word forgery between us like a new object we were forced to hold. I had to wonder who would stoop to such a thing. The only people who seemed likely were those who saw the house as a line on a balance sheet, a position to acquire. Ethan and I started to pull the thread. Where had the paper been printed? Who had prepared the transfers? The trail led to a small print shop downtown. According to their logs, a file matching the forged document was printed 2 days after the funeral. The IP address used to upload the file traced back to an account tied to a company associated with Daniel. Bank transfers moved through a chain of shell accounts and ended up in an investment portfolio in Laura's name. This wasn't impulse. It was a planned operation, neat and ugly. I remember the night Daniel and Laura held a gathering at the house. I stood in the dark behind the curtains and watched candlelight and laughter. Their guests drank wine and discussed projects, unaware that paperwork across town was working to erase me from the property. I couldn't sleep. I thought of my father and his small rituals, whistling when he carved meat, tucking $1 into my shoe on birthdays. How quickly those small moments became clues, how quickly the house turned into something to be sold. Ethan said, "We need subpoenas. We need a forensic audit. We'll file a complaint with the police." I replied, "Do it. Let them see who planned this." On the third day, detectives came. They were methodical and professional. They examined copies, logged printer records, ordered handwriting analysis. A local news crew sniffed around for a story. I told the reporter simply, "My parents loved this house. I'm trying to honor them." I did not want cameras, I wanted the truth. The evidence accumulated. Digital logs showing uploads, print receipts, emails arranging transfers. The sheriff served search warrants. Daniel opened the door with his hands in his pockets, looking tired, like a man whose armor had been buffed too many times. Deputies found printer logs, draft copies, and emails that arranged the transfers. His face went pale when they read him his rights. "Daniel," my brother said as they led him away. "Margaret, you don't have to make this stick. We could have handled it quietly." I replied, "You handled it by betraying the people who raised you." The fallout was uglier than I expected. Friends asking for explanations, cousins picking sides, old social orders cracking. I lost some people like loose pages in the wind. I found others. Neighbors who remembered my mother's casseroles. A teacher whose family we'd helped years back. Small kindnesses mattered. A blanket handed down from Mrs. Raymond, the man 2 houses over who cut my lawn for free. Then another piece fell into place. Ethan called from his office with a voice like someone reading a map. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "Your parents set up an off-books account years ago tied to local charitable work. It's clean. It was meant to support the house in perpetuity. Whoever orchestrated those transfers was trying to detach that protection and siphon liquidity. My father, it turned out, had quietly built a small endowment for the house's upkeep and scholarships. He'd done it without fanfare and told few. Daniel had assumed the account was an unlocked trove. He was wrong." Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "Because your parents planned, we have standing. The funds can be secured. The house can be returned." I replied, "And Daniel?" Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "He's facing charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The evidence is strong." I felt no triumph in that. There is an emptiness to victory when it's measured by indictments rather than reconciliation. Court proceedings were long and precise. Daniel's defense crumbled. Laura agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Later I heard she sat on the porch of a halfway house, cigarette in hand, staring at the lawn like it was some unsolvable puzzle. When the house came back to me, it needed paint, a new roof, and a furnace that didn't growl at midnight. I walked every room like someone inspecting a healed wound, checking the seams, mapping the scars, learning how to live in a life stitched back together. I framed the scrap of my father's handwriting that said, "Margaret, I want the house to come to you. Not as a trophy but as quiet proof." I told myself the first nights back, "This is your life now." I replied, "Yes, it is." Months later, I opened a small nonprofit in my parents' names to support elders at risk of financial exploitation. We offered free consultations, simple legal clinics, a hotline a neighbor could call without shame. The first woman through the door was a widow whose grandson helped her with her bank and then made excuses when the bills came. We sat and I listened. She cried once and then laughed at something small. Her laugh sounded like rain after a long drought. The quiet aftermath taught me things. Betrayal isn't always dramatic. It's often domestic: a check unsigned, a key taken without asking, a sentence in a document that changes a life. The law is imperfect, but useful if you have the patience to push paper and the resolve to wait for people in suits to do what a private heart cannot. Owning a house, I learned, is not only bricks and windows but the work of deciding who you will be when relatives disappear. People ask if I forgave Daniel. Forgiveness is private. I won't pretend the wounds vanished or that family dinners are the same. But I stopped waking with my throat tight. I stopped rehearsing his arrest like a private revenge film. I poured my energy into the hotline, into workshops on reading bank statements, into speaking up. If someone asks you to sign something, call me first. At night I sit on the back porch and listen to the neighborhood settle. The house smells of the cedar my father liked and the lemon cleaner my mother used. I feed the cat that wandered in during the chaos and decided to stay. Sometimes a car slows and the driver looks toward the porch like it's a landmark. I think of my parents and their small, steady love, and of the odd fact that when everything falls apart, you can sometimes put together something more honest. If you think this is only a story about money and property, you're half right. It's also about what happens when the people who raised you decide they can rewrite the rules. It's about learning to use the law without losing your humanity, about finding purpose in the wreckage, and about the slow, quiet work of making a house a home again. The days that followed moved like litigation, slow, deliberate, and merciless in their predictability. I spent them in a rhythm I had not expected. Phone calls, copies, small humiliations. Mornings I woke to the motel clock and the smell of stale coffee. Afternoons I sat at the county clerk's window until the fluorescent light made my eyes ache. Evenings I drove back to the house with a bag of paperwork and stood in the doorway while the light went out in rooms that had once been ordinary. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "We need subpoenas for the print shop, the bank records, and the IP logs. I'll sign them today." I replied, "Do it. Whatever it takes." He moved with that careful pace of a man who knows the law but hates the theater of it. He filed papers, called contacts, and kept his voice low on the phone so our business didn't become town gossip before it had teeth. The print shop smelled of toner and hot plastic when Ethan and I walked in. The owner, a compact man named Harold, wiped his hands on a towel and tilted his head like someone trying to remember a face from a faded photograph. Harold, print shop owner, said, "We keep logs for big jobs. If a file was uploaded, we can pull the timestamp." He turned us to a screen and scrolled. The timestamp was 2 days after the funeral. The file name matched the document Daniel had shown me. Harold, print shop owner, said, "The upload came from an IP that resolves to an account registered to VentureCo." I replied, "VentureCo? That's Daniel's company." Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "Print chain and upload logs are exactly what we need. Good work." The evidence clicked into place like metal teeth meshing. It felt small and enormous at once. Word spread before I wanted it to. At the grocery, the clerk asked softly, "Are you Margaret Hale?" Mrs. Raymond across the street left a casserole on my car, hood with an apologetic smile, and then stood on her porch talking to anyone who would listen. Neighbors came by with pie and with warnings. They said things in half phrases. "You know your brother." And I learned how people make choices about which side in a family fight they will stand. Some stood with me. Some moved their feet like a silent vote. Laura's uncle brought over a salad and an apology that tasted like lemon and calculation. It was a small-town ritual food, and the taking of temperature. Daniel, my brother, dropped by once in the gray between breakfast and noon, as if to measure how much of me remained human under the paperwork. Daniel, my brother, said, "Maggie, there are complications. We can offer you a settlement, money for your trouble." I replied, "You mean pay me to be quiet while you keep what isn't yours?" He said, "Think about taxes, the legal costs." I replied, "I didn't sign away my parents for convenience." He left with a tight smile and a fistful of excuses. His car hummed down the street like a promise not to return. I watched the taillights and felt less than anything until the scrap in my wallet warmed against my palm. Ink in my father's loopdar. Proof that some promises had been plain. Ethan arranged for an auditor to look at bank flows. The auditor, a woman named Priya, sat in my kitchen with a laptop and a gravity that made numbers feel like living things. Priya, forensic auditor, said, "Money moves to concealment in layers. Shell companies, intercompany transfers, then a sweep to a portfolio. It looks designed to reduce traceability." I replied, "So they expected no one to look." Priya, forensic auditor, said, "They counted on grief and the assumption that elderly estates are messy. They assumed inertia would cover them." Her eyes were hard in the way only people who study numbers get, unblinking, used to betrayal encoded in decimals. There were days when anger arrived like a tide and left the same way. Sudden heat, then a cold backwash. I found myself reading emails aloud into the phone for Ethan. "Here, look at this transfer," I would say, and his voice would tighten. "Freeze these accounts. Issue subpoenas. Serve notices." I learned to ask for things by procedure instead of by plea. There is a peculiar dignity in paperwork when you have learned it must carry the weight of your life. Laura's behavior shifted. The confident, curtain-choosing woman began to look thin at the edges. She called once and left a message that had a tremor in it. Laura, his wife, said on voicemail, "Margaret, I'm sorry. We didn't mean to hurt." I didn't call back. Apology recorded and unanswered felt to me like a public performance of contrition. A few days later, a neighbor told me Laura had been seen at the bank, arguing with the teller, pressing for wire delays and for favors that the bank politely refused. The banking manager, when subpoenaed, said, "We flagged unusual transfers and froze them pending investigation." The freeze felt like a small victory. A boulder rolled onto the path they had carved. One afternoon, the county detective, Detective Ruiz, arrived with an evidence bag and a look that said she'd seen greed before and waste after. Detective Ruiz, county detective, said, "We need to ask Daniel some questions. It's better we come with paperwork than with public fanfare." I replied, "Do it quietly." She nodded. Her presence was a quiet gravity. Someone responsible for weighing facts against family stories. She moved with little ceremony, and her questions dug into timestamps and witness statements with the gentle brutality of someone trying to pry a truth out of reluctance. Daniel started to press in the small ways desperate people do. A cousin called, then another. A woman from church stopped smiling when she saw me at service. The tribe shifted. At the hardware store, a man who'd once mowed our lawn crossed the street rather than meet my eye. A child from down the block ran into me with a paper airplane and then fled. I learned quickly that the social ledger matters in small towns. People keep accounts in smiles and whispers. Ethan arranged for a deposition. The room smelled of cheap coffee and paper. Daniel sat across from us with his lawyer, his face made of practiced blankness. "Daniel," my brother said, "we acted in good faith. Our intent wasn't malicious." I replied, "You acted to take what didn't belong to you." His lawyer tried to steer the language to administrative confusion, to misinterpretation. But when the print shop owner testified about the upload timestamp, and when Priya displayed a chart of transfers through shell entities into Laura's portfolio, the veneer thinned. Evidence is a quiet disassembler. It removes pretense with the flatness of a scalpel. That night someone slashed the tires on my car. I found the shredded rubber in the soft light before the motel office opened. I told Ethan, who said, "I will file it. We will get the surveillance from the motel. We will document threats." I replied, "I don't want to be scared into silence." He said, "No one will make you move by fear. We are building a record." Fear had different textures now. Tire rubber under my shoe, a voicemail that didn't finish. I started sleeping with the lamp on and a copy of the county will on the bedside table like a talisman that was also a legal instrument. As the investigation deepened, an unexpected voice arrived on my behalf. Reverend Collins from the church where my parents had sung hymns. Reverend Collins, my pastor, said from the pulpit one Sunday, "Our community must not let family be destroyed by greed. We will help Margaret while the law does its work." It was small, just a mention, but it shifted the social tide like a hand under a boat. People who had been quiet came forward, offering affidavits. The neighbor who'd seen Daniel in the study with a laptop at odd hours, the cousin who recalled a strange meeting in Daniel's office that summer. Witnesses are not dramatic in themselves. They are stitches that, when pulled tight, reveal the seam. Ethan warned me the next phase could be public. He said, "If evidence supports it, we will request search warrants. That is the moment when this leaves the private sphere." I replied, "Then let it leave. Let the truth be visible." The night before any warrant was served, I sat in the house for the first time in weeks. The living room smelled like old wood and lemon polish. I touched the arm of my father's chair, sat where he had sat, and read the scrap in my palm. The words were small and simple. "Margaret, I want the house to come to you." I said aloud to the empty room, "I won't let paper erase you." Outside, the street was quiet, but the quiet felt like the breath held before a bell. At dawn the next morning the phone rang once. On the screen it said, "Ethan Price." I answered, and his voice was an incision of urgency. "They've obtained the warrant. They'll move at first light." I replied, "I'll be there." I dressed without thinking, jeans, sweater, the faded shawl my mother knitted, and walked to the front porch. The sky was thin with gray. Somewhere a dog barked and stopped. The house held its breath with me. Then, as the sun lifted, headlights pulled at the end of the drive and men in plain coats moved toward the door. They told me to expect paperwork and patience. They did not warn me about the way a name could make a town tilt. The ledger page with those 3 initials, R.B., became a fulcrum. Once someone from the evidence room typed those letters into a search, a dozen quietly kept things set in motion. Priya, the forensic auditor, said, "The account number on the ledger traces to Baxter and Rowe Investments. The beneficiary is listed as R. Baxter." I replied, "Baxter?" As in Priya, forensic auditor, said, "Richard Baxter. He's on the county redevelopment board." The words landed like a dropped coin. Richard Baxter. Known, respected, donor to the library. A man who wore linen suits in summer, and whose name was always on the plaque at fundraisers. If the initials led to him, the case stopped being a family quarrel and started being a scandal. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "We need to be surgical. Publicly naming him without proof drags us into defamation and distracts from the estate theft." I replied, "But if he took funds," Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "let the investigators follow the money. We will get subpoenas for Baxter and Rowe's records." Detective Ruiz, county detective, moved with the low speed of someone arranging a chessboard. She said, "We will obtain a warrant for financial records. We will do it quietly to avoid tipping anyone off." Quiet had been a hard thing to come by. The search of Baxter and Rowe's offices was the sort of thing you read about in national papers. Their reception smelled of citrus and brand brochures. A woman at the front desk asked for identification. Detective Ruiz showed a warrant and the room changed. It is surprising how authority transmutes the ordinary. Priya and I stood back as officers requested server logs and transaction histories. A junior analyst unspooled a list and then paused. He said, "There's a recurring counterparty that moves through these accounts at similar intervals to the transfers listed in the ledger." Ethan Price, the lawyer, leaned in and read aloud the list. He said, "These correspond to dates in the ledger, and to transfers that originated from accounts tied to Daniel's entities." I replied, "So they were moving money through Baxter's firm to hide origin?" The analyst nodded. When the investigators called Baxter, he answered on the first ring. Richard Baxter, redevelopment board member, said into the phone with a calm that was meant to steady, "Detective Ruiz? I have nothing to hide." Detective Ruiz, county detective, said, "We need a full production of your partnership's recent wire activity and any KYC records for beneficiaries." There was a pause, then Baxter said, "You have my full cooperation." His voice was measured. It had an ease that made it dangerous. The deeper we dug, the stranger the architecture of the theft appeared. Someone had designed a route that folded funds outward and back like origami. Shell companies, wiring centers, a boutique of financial opacity. Each fold made it harder to trace, but it also produced metadata. IPs, timestamps, signature hashes. Priya said, "They underestimated the traceability of modern records. People who think money is invisible forget the little footprints they leave online." I replied, "They thought grief would be enough cover." Priya, forensic auditor, said, "Grief helps. Greed hides behind assumptions." Word leaked faster than any of us wanted. The local paper posted a short piece. "Family dispute over estate leads to investigation." Before the Baxter search returned results that made bigger headlines. People in bars and grocery lines reached different conclusions depending on who they spoke to. Some whispered that Daniel had overreached. Others insisted Baxter was a scapegoat. The town felt like a bowl of people stirred. Then the sign came. An email trail linking Baxter and Rowe to Daniel's transfers, and a name I did not expect. R.B. meant Richard Baxter, all right, but it also pointed to a subcontractor who worked on the county's public projects. A man named Robert Bell. Robert Bell had business cards, a title as construction consultant, and as it turned out, a private company that had received small, steady deposits timed to the ledger entries. Priya, forensic auditor, said, "Bell's company moved money shortly after Baxter's accounts show sweeps. It's a pass-through." I replied, "So the money went from Daniel through Baxter to Bell and then dispersed." The pattern read like a map of complicity. Detective Ruiz called a press conference, Not to accuse but to outline the facts. We have probable cause to believe a network of transfers was used to divert estate funds. Cameras clicked and recorded my face while I tried to stand still. Reverend Collins stood in the second row, his hands folded. He mouthed a prayer that felt like a benediction and a warning. People on the sidewalk looked at me with the curiosity that justice sometimes draws, cold, sharp, and public. Daniel's name was joined in a legal filing to Baxter's and Bell's. Daniel, my brother, watched the world tilt under the weight of those filings with a face that seemed to think the ground should have been softer. Daniel, my brother, said to his lawyer in a low voice inside the courthouse, "We never thought they'd trace it back." His lawyer, a man who smelled of expensive coffee and older lawyers' fatigue, said, "They left digital crumbs. Someone pushed too hard." I replied, "You trusted people you should not have trusted." The thinness of excuses crystallized. As the network unfurled, a new urgency arrived. Banks that had been politely delaying began to act. Priya said, "They froze accounts linked to Baxter and Rowe and to Robert Bell's company. There are recovery paths, but it requires coordination with federal examiners." I replied, "Does this mean the money can come back?" Priya, forensic auditor, said, "Some of it. But the longer funds circulate, the harder recovery becomes. The arithmetic of loss is cruel and precise." In the middle of the legal machinery, small human things kept happening. Mrs. Raymond brought soup and a face that refused to be sour. Reverend Collins dropped off a basket with a note that read simply, "Hold steady." Detective Ruiz stopped by once, not with a warrant but with a paper bag of donuts, and said, "You're doing fine. This is what the system looks like when it works." I replied, "It feels like watching a complicated clock." She smiled with tired relief. Ethan set up a conference with federal agents. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "Once a municipal board member and an investment firm are implicated, there is a jurisdictional interest. This could go beyond county lines." I replied, "Bring them in." When the agents came, they arrived with formalities and an appetite for combing through records I had not imagined anyone would read. Their questions were blunt. Who signed off on transfers? Who had authority to authorize beneficiary changes? I answered as best I could, and each time my responses fit like a piece in a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. Then, 3 days after the Baxter search, a subpoena turned into a grand jury appearance. The grand jury wanted witnesses and the prosecutor wanted names and dates. Ethan said, "They'll want you to testify about what your father told you and about how and when you discovered the forged document." I replied, "I will tell the truth." The thought of sitting under oath was heavy, but truth had a hardness that steadied me now. The morning before the grand jury, I walked through the house with Detective Ruiz at my side. Light came through the lace curtains and the rooms felt like pages in a book you read slowly to keep from tearing them. Detective Ruiz, county detective, said, "They'll use your testimony carefully. We need precise recollection on dates and statements. Small things are evidence here." I replied, "I'll do it." I took a deep breath and touched the back of my father's chair, as if the fabric held a memory that could help me speak straight. The house smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Outside, a neighbor mowed his lawn in an exact line and the town hum continued. That afternoon, the grand jury room was a long table and a panel of citizens listening for a thread. I sat under warm lights and answered questions about conversations, about where I had kept the scrap of my father's writing, about the days after the funeral when Daniel arrived with the envelope. The prosecutor asked me to describe the handwriting on the authentic will and on the forged document. My throat tightened, but the ink in my memory lined up in the way witnesses' memories sometimes do. When I finished, a hush settled. The grand jury deliberated and then returned with a decision: true bills on multiple counts. The prosecutor looked at me with a mix of professional gravity and a human, almost relieved nod. Ethan squeezed my hand. Outside the courthouse that day, cameras focused not only on Daniel but on the names Baxter and Bell. Richard Baxter, photographed with a suit slightly rumpled, denied wrongdoing and said he would cooperate. Robert Bell refused comment through his attorney. For the first time since the letter on the kitchen table, I felt like the town had shifted its axis toward truth. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope that bore the words for Margaret. I opened it slowly, though evidence rules would later say not to. and read my father's neat, crooked script. "Keep the house," he had written. Beneath his line was another, smudged, typed, a lawyer's formal language confirming intention. I folded the paper and placed it next to the motel receipt that recorded my first night away. The two papers felt like bookends to the part of my life that had been taken and the part one was reclaiming. A new name had entered our story, and it would not be simple. R.B. had become Richard Baxter and Robert Bell, men who wore influence like armor. The next morning the paper announced an indictment pending. I slept in short bursts and dreamed of ledgers. When I woke, the world felt marginally safer. But the ledger had more lines, and the more we followed them, the more people we would have to look in the eye. The story was widening, and with it the danger and the stakes. Tomorrow we would call witnesses who worked at Baxter and Rowe. Tomorrow we would see if the town's reputation could survive the truth. The indictment changed the town's rhythm. Suddenly court dates punctuated conversations that had once been about bake sales and school plays. Papers and subpoenas multiplied. I learned the cadence of legal time. Hearings, motions, delays, more hearings. It was exhausting in a way grief had not been. But it also felt like work that mattered. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "Prepare to be called as a witness at trial. They may try to crack you on cross-examination. Stick to what you know." I replied, "I'll tell the truth." He looked at me with that steady, careful look that had steadied me through everything so far. "And we'll protect you where we can," he added. Grand jury indictments became arrests. Richard Baxter and Robert Bell were taken into custody. Men who'd sat at ribbon cuttings and smiled for charity plaques, now walking into booking rooms. The cameras liked the irony. Detective Ruiz, county detective, said, "This is why we follow paper. Public position doesn't grant immunity." I replied, "It certainly doesn't." The trial calendar filled weeks that tasted like cold metal. Witness lists were long. Priya's audits were printed in 12-point font and bound like small books. Depositions dragged people into rooms where memory and motive were tested. Some witnesses wilted. Others held steady. I watched as the town decided who would be forgiven and who would be condemned. Laura cooperated in exchange for leniency. Her bargain was painful to watch. She answered questions about meetings, transfers, and the way decisions had been framed as business necessities. Laura, his wife, said on the stand with hands that shook, "I thought I was helping. I didn't understand the scale." Ethan Price, the lawyer, objected. The prosecutor let it through. Her testimony helped the prosecutors connect dots that numbers alone could not. At the first big hearing, the prosecutor laid out the pattern fabricated documents, the print shop upload, the chain of transfers through Baxter and Rowe and Bell's companies. The courtroom was packed. Daniel sat with his attorney, jaw clenched. "Daniel, my brother," said quietly to his lawyer, "tell them I was only trying to secure my future." I replied later in the hush of my car outside the courthouse, "No one secures a future by stealing someone else's life. Evidence does something strange in a room. It flattens excuses." When Priya traced wire after wire and showed how funds looped through accounts before ending in portfolios, the geometry of greed became visible. When Ethan called forward the envelope marked for Margaret and the letters inside, my father's hand, the lawyer's note, the judge and jury could see intention in a way numbers could not. The jury instructions felt like a high, thin rope to walk. Intent, knowledge, and the law's precise definition of theft. Days bled into weeks. There were setbacks. A key witness had a health scare. A piece of digital evidence required a motion to authenticate. There was a weekend when I slept so little I could feel the edges of my jaw. But then small victories. A sealed motion unsealed. Bank holds turned to temporary recoveries. A restitution figure began to coalesce on a spreadsheet that had once only made me dizzy. At a hearing in late spring, the defense offered a plea from Robert Bell. Robert Bell, construction consultant, said in court, "I accept responsibility for my role and will cooperate fully." I replied, "Cooperation helps." His agreement opened doors to evidence that otherwise might have stayed closed. In a way that felt like pruning, one cooperation led to another. Baxter's posture shifted. His lawyer whispered urgently during a recess. The weight of connected evidence made options narrow. Then came the day the jury returned a verdict on the lead counts. Inside the courtroom, under bright lights and with the air conditioned to a thin clarity, jurors filed in. handed the clerk folded papers, and sat like a small, terrible jury of conscience. We held our breath. The foreperson stood and read. The room that had been heavy with procedure exhaled in a single long sound that could be hope or release. Richard Baxter and Robert Bell were found guilty on multiple counts related to conspiracy and money laundering. Daniel was found guilty on charges including forging a document to deprive an heir of her inheritance. I watched each name called as if watching parts of a storm break. The men who had thought themselves protected by position and planning sat as sentences were discussed. Daniel's face had the same stunned, thin look as on the day he was handcuffed. It had become his. Laura, who had testified, sat with her head bowed, tears wetting the palms of her hands. Sentencing was quieter than the trial, as if the public spectacle had been a carnival, and this was the aftermath where reckoning got technical. The judge pronounced terms that matched statutory ranges, years for those who had plotted and months for those who had followed, with restitution orders and supervised release. When the marshal led Daniel back toward custody, he caught my eye and mouthed something I couldn't hear. I did not feel triumph. I felt the odd, sober thing that comes when consequences finally meet choices. Restitution was messy. Money had changed hands, investments had moved, some assets were gone or diminished. But because of the careful work of auditors, prosecutors, and the bank's willingness to freeze and unwind some transfers, a portion of funds was recovered. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "We recovered enough to repair the house and to set up the fund you want." I replied, "That's what matters." The house was repaired. A new roof, fresh paint, a furnace that purred rather than growled. I walked each room and found the scars softened by sunlight and new curtains. When the dust settled, I opened the nonprofit in my parents' name. We called it the Hale Trust for Seniors. Its first office was a small room above a bakery. A table, a phone, a filing cabinet, and a notice board where volunteers pinned resources. The first clients arrived with stories that warmed and broke my heart. An older woman whose grandson had arranged help with her accounts, a retired teacher who'd signed away power of attorney to a friendly neighbor, a man who'd been scammed on a grand scale. We offered legal referrals, simple classes on reading statements, and a hotline manned by patient volunteers. Reverend Collins, my pastor, said at one of our first fundraisers, "Margaret transformed loss into protection for others." I replied, "I just don't want this to happen again." The gratitude from families we helped began to stitch back some of the holes left by betrayal. People still asked if I forgave Daniel. Forgiveness for me wasn't a public statement. It was a private arithmetic. The weight of what happened versus the weight of what remained. I walked past his photograph in my mind like someone moving down a hallway I'm no longer required to open doors to. Some family ties were permanently rearranged. Invitations went unanswered. Some cousins never returned calls. Yet other relationships deepened. The neighbors who brought casseroles, the woman from church who became a volunteer at the hotline, the strangers who sent notes saying my story helped them act. On quiet evenings I paint in the old study we turned into a studio. The canvas takes paint the way the house takes light, covering old marks with new layers. Sometimes I paint a chair with a looped back, Dad's chair. And sometimes I paint the kitchen table where the envelope once lay. The table is always there, and I like to leave a small space on it. A cup, a folded napkin, a place for company. I think of the many women I've met over the years who carry private collapses like small, dangerous jars. To them I say what I learned in the courtroom and at the kitchen table. Keep records, ask questions, and find someone who listens. The town has settled into a different rhythm. The plaques still hang in the library, though one name is now attached to an asterisk in local memory. I still see people who avert their eyes. I still hear gossip because gossip is a hard thing to starve. But when a woman in her 60s calls our hotline and says, "Voice small, I think my son altered my account," there is a steadying voice on the other end that will tell her what I wish someone had told me sooner. Don't be ashamed. Start with paper. Call a lawyer. Call the police if it's urgent. You're not alone. If you ask whether I am the same person who slept on the motel couch that first week, the answer is both yes and no. The core of me, the part that remembers my father's small rituals, that keeps his scrap of handwriting in a drawer, remains. But I learned to speak in ways that made paper move for me, to take small powers that elderly women are often denied. I learned that stubbornness can be a tool and that law, when used patiently and precisely, can be a kind of justice. Tonight the back porch light glows the same color it always did. A cat pats by and jumps into my lap. I think of my parents and of the slow work it took to make their house mine again. There is damage that never fully smooths out. There are people whose names I will not say at holiday dinners. But there is also an office above a bakery where a woman used to be afraid, and now she stands and helps another woman read a bank statement. That, more than any sentence handed down in a courtroom, feels like the place where truth rests. Years folded the rough edges of that season into something I could look at without flinching. Paperwork gave way to program planning. Court dates became checkboxes on a calendar rather than the center of my days. The house stayed. The nonprofit grew. The work of repairing lives, practical, slow, bureaucratic, became the shape of my mornings. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "We should set up the restitution so it's protected and used for the trust, not for lawyers' fees." I replied, "Do it. Make it last." We structured a small endowment from the recovered funds and matched it with donations. The Hale Trust for Seniors started with legal clinics and a hotline. 2 years later, we ran workshops at the community center, taught 4 free classes a month, and partnered with the county aging office to reach women who didn't know how to read a bank statement. Priya, the forensic auditor, visited one Tuesday and told a story that made my chest ache the right kind of ache. We helped recover funds for a widow in Jefferson. She used the money to pay overdue medical bills and to stay in her house. I replied, "That's why we do this." The trust set up a tiny grant program for immediate needs, paying a month's mortgage to stop a foreclosure, hiring a lawyer for a power of attorney dispute, getting an accountant to untangle a messy estate. The grants were small. Their effects were large. Letters arrived in the mail, some short, some long. A woman wrote from Ohio, "Your story on the local station saved my mother." Another woman, whose grandson had been quietly moving money, sent a note, "I didn't know where to start. Your hotline caller walked me through the first steps." Those notes stacked on my kitchen shelf like quiet proof that the mess had made a good. There were harder letters too. Daniel, my brother, wrote from a facility. "I am sorry," one line read. Another page tried to explain a lifetime of grievances that had nothing to do with our parents' will, and everything to do with the small resentments that grow into entitlement. I read them once or twice and then stopped. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "You can choose to respond if you think it helps you heal." I replied, "I don't owe him a conversation. I owe myself peace." Forgiveness was private. Boundaries were public and necessary. Richard Baxter and Robert Bell faced the consequences the law could reach. Priya said, "We recovered a meaningful portion of the diverted funds. Not everything, but enough to fund operations and a modest repair fund." I replied, "Rebuild the house. Help one person at a time." The repairs were finished: new roof, new porch boards, curtains that let in light. I painted the study so many times I learned which blues held the day and which held the night. The town adjusted. Some neighbors kept their distance. Others became friends in a new way. Reverend Collins, my pastor, said at a community dinner, "The generosity of the Hales returned to the community through Margaret's work." I replied, "We simply tried to close a circle my parents opened." At fundraisers we told the story plainly. What happened, what to watch for, how to act. Women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s came forward at the meetings, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears, sometimes with practical questions about joint accounts and POAs. We answered all of it. Once a reporter asked me, "Are you angry?" I said, "Yes, sometimes. But I'm more interested in useful things, how to prevent this, how to repair it." The reporter nodded and later wrote a piece that reached a wider audience, which brought calls from groups interested in adapting our model. Ethan Price, the lawyer, said, "You could be a resource to other towns." I replied, "If they want the help." We began consulting with the Regional Elder Services Coalition and provided templates for simple legal checklists that older people could keep at home. There were small human victories that mattered more than any headline. A widow named Joan came to our clinic with trembling hands and a stack of statements. Joan, a new client, said, "I thought signing for my grandson was helping him." I replied, "Let's look together." We found transfers, froze a pending withdrawal, and connected Joan with an attorney who helped her regain control of her accounts. Joan later hugged me in my office and said, "You gave me my house back." I cried then in a good way. Time did something else I hadn't expected. It loosened the ache where resentment had lived and left curiosity in its place. I painted more. I planted bulbs in the front garden. I started a small book club at the church that met once a month. No agenda beyond conversation. The house was less a battlefield and more a place that held ordinary days. Bread baking, mail arriving, a neighbor stopping by with tomatoes. Sometimes the past reached forward in odd ways. A podcast host asked to interview me about elder fraud. Ethan warned, "You don't have to do media." I replied, "If it helps one person know what to look for, I'll do it." The episode reached listeners across the country. I heard from women who wrote, "I listened while washing dishes, and I couldn't sleep after your story, so I called my bank." Those messages felt like ripples. There were ruins that never fully smoothed. Invitations were declined. Family photos had spaces where faces used to be. At holiday dinners, I learned how to rearrange traditions so they fit the new shape of our family. I taught my nieces how to read a bank statement and told them plainly, "Don't assume knowledge about money comes with age. Teach each other." On a quiet Sunday, I walked into the study and found a young volunteer cleaning canvases for our fundraiser. She looked up and said, "You inspired me to work with elders." I replied, "Then stay. We'll teach you the rest." She laughed and told me a story about her grandmother. Her voice was bright. Her energy was a small promise that the work would continue. At night, I still touched the scrap of paper with my father's handwriting, now framed and hanging in the study. Sometimes I read it aloud. "Margaret, I want the house to come to you." The sentence is small and stubborn, keeps its place. If someone asks me now what to do first, my answer is practical. Gather paper, get a lawyer, document everything. If someone asked what to do last, I'd say, tend the life you want after the firewalls. Build a small, steady thing that helps others, because justice is often a long, boring, stubborn process, and the people who survive it are the ones who turn the paperwork into protection. I do not pretend the scars are gone. I do not pretend every family mends. But I do know this. A woman who once slept on a motel couch now runs a small trust that keeps people in their homes. That truth weighs less like a burden and more like work that fits my hands. If you are listening and something in your family smells wrong, keep the papers, ask questions, and find someone who will stand with you. You're not invisible. You have a voice that can make paper work for you. Years later, the case lived in a different part of my life. Not the hot center of every day, but a background hum that appeared when papers needed signing or a caller needed calm. The Hale Trust had a small staff now. A coordinator, 2 volunteers, a retired paralegal who ran intake, and the work had shape. Still, life kept offering surprises. One spring morning, a letter arrived with a return address I hadn't expected. It was from the parole board. A hearing had been scheduled to review Daniel's early release based on good behavior and overcrowding provisions. The notice folded into my hands like a new summons. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope and the framed scrap of my father's handwriting beside it, thinking about small things, how light falls on curtains, how the cat likes the same spot by the south window. There was an immediate animal reflex to throw the letter away. Then a steadier thought. Decisions like this are public, and they demand a public witness. I called Ethan. "Ethan Price," the lawyer said. "You can submit a victim impact statement. You can attend the hearing. You don't have to, this is optional." I replied, "I want to be there. I'm tired of being the person that happens to things." He added, "We'll prepare the statement carefully. Keep it factual and honest." In the weeks before the hearing, I kept a ritual. Mornings were for the trust, emails, calls, a once-a-week clinic at the senior center, and evenings I sat with the scrap in my hand and wrote. I wrote about what had been taken, about the hollow of family dinners, about the long afternoons sorting photos and the embarrassment of asking for legal help. I wrote about the ways small betrayals calcify into big absence. I wrote not to rehearse pain but to make a record. On the day of the hearing, the parole boardroom smelled like disinfectant and coffee. A handful of neighbors came with me. Reverend Collins, who always wore a blue sweater that matched his calm, Mrs. Raymond, who refused to dress down for anything that mattered, and Priya, the auditor, who came to support the truth she'd helped reveal. Ethan sat beside me with a stack of documents and that low, steady look that had been my anchor. The hearing was procedural and slow. Officials asked about Daniel's conduct in custody. Letters from programs he completed were read aloud. A corrections counselor described changes in his behavior. Daniel, my brother, did not look like the man who'd walked out in cuffs that first morning. Time had ground him down and flattened him in ways public papers don't capture. He had aged, and the lines around his mouth had softened into something like acceptance. When the board invited victims to speak, I stood. The room tightened, like an audience leaning in for the moral of a story. I read what I'd written. I avoided theatrics, I gave dates, the impact, the economics, the way the theft had forced me into debt while I fought to keep a roof over the house my parents left me. I also read the quieter lines. How insomnia and mistrust live in my chest, how holidays had been rearranged. I said, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because public safety and private loss intersect in this case. I finished with, if the board believes Daniel's release serves the public good, they must also believe restitution is meaningful, and that he has actually changed in ways that prevent him from harming others again. I sat down and felt the weight of telling truth in public. The board denied early release on the grounds of the severity of his crimes, and the need for full restitution before any consideration of reintegration. The hearing's formality felt like a ledger balanced in real time. A record stating that harm has consequences, and that those consequences are visible. Ethan squeezed my hand as we left. Outside, a woman stopped and took my hand, thanking me for coming. Her eyes were wet and grateful in a way that felt like a benediction. That night I slept better than I had in a long while, not because anything changed overnight, but because I had not let the moment pass me by. Presence had a shape. Saying the facts aloud made them belong to more than one person. After the hearing, an invitation arrived that surprised us all. A state legislator asked to meet because she had heard about the Hale Trust and wanted to propose a bill strengthening protections for estate handling and adding a simple elder guardian review step for large transfers after a death. She said, your case showed gaps. I want to close one. We met in a small conference room above the county courthouse. Senator Alvarez, state senator, said, if you have the facts and a model, we can draft something that makes a difference. I replied, we do. We have templates, intake forms, case studies. But we'll need data and stories to show why it's necessary. That work policy was not glamorous. It meant meetings, spreadsheets, drafting language with lawyers who spoke in conditional clauses. It meant calling witnesses, asking survivors for permission to anonymize their stories, and sitting through committee hearings where old men in suits asked skeptical questions. Ethan coached me on testimony. Stick to examples. Don't moralize. Show the process. I practiced lines in front of the mirror until they sounded like a neighbor telling the truth at a kitchen table. The bill moved slowly and then suddenly with momentum. The proposed elder estate review required that any large property transfer following a death go through a short, mandatory review period where an independent attorney would confirm signatures, and a social worker would verify that the surviving elder was acting freely. It wasn't perfect, but it created a pause. An administrative pause that could stop a determined family member from using grief as a cloak. When the committee passed the bill, the applause in the hearing room felt like neighbors bringing casseroles after a hard week. Reverend Collins cried in the pew that Sunday. I didn't, but I felt the tear lines of relief like small channels in the chest. The law didn't erase what had happened to me. Daniel remained incarcerated for the term set by the judge. Richard Baxter and Robert Bell served sentences and paid fines. Some funds had been recovered, some vanished into complex investments that couldn't be fully unwound. But the law changed the future for other families. Calls to the Hale Trust increased the month after the bill passed. People wanted help to navigate new protections and to learn how to use the pauses the law required. On a more personal note, time offered small reconciliations and quiet boundaries. A niece, Claire, began to call more often. Claire, my niece, said one afternoon over tea. Aunt Maggie, I didn't know how to help. I'm sorry. I replied, show up. Ask questions. Don't assume. She visited the trust as a volunteer and later brought a friend who studied banking. It felt like mending in practical stitches. There were also moments I chose not to open doors. Letters from Daniel arrived sporadically, apologies that mixed contrition with justification. I read one or two and then stopped. Ethan advised restraint. I replied to myself, you can let his letters rest in a file. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be private and limited. My life now had a perimeter. The trust kept growing cautiously. We partnered with 2 regional banks to provide a quick check hotline. A teller could call us when a transfer looked unusual, and we would help hold it while an attorney confirmed. That small protocol stopped several attempts over the next year. We taught classes on simple estate planning, and Priya produced a checklist of red flags. Rush requests to sign, unusual transfers to unknown accounts, sudden urgencies that coincide with grief. Sometimes a reporter wanted a neat ending. There isn't one. There are only chapters. Some people apologize. Others are never heard from again. But the house stayed. I repainted the study a blue that held morning light. I still keep the scrap of my father's handwriting in the same frame, and sometimes I take it down and read it aloud. Margaret, I want the house to come to you. The sentence is small and stubborn. Keeps its place. If a woman calls the trust at night, voice shaky, saying her daughter helped with the bank and then grew secretive, we sit and give her a checklist and a number to call. If a legislator asks for data, we pull anonymized files and testimony. If a neighbor drops off pie, we say thank you and tuck it into the fridge for later. These are ordinary acts that, stitched together, make a life that holds rather than unravels. One evening, years after the first envelope, I stood on the same kitchen porch where the paper had once lain and watched kids ride bikes in the street. A woman new to the neighborhood walked past and waved. She had heard about the trust. She said, "I volunteer sometimes. I like helping people keep what matters." I replied, "Then come on in. There's always a pot of coffee and work to do." She smiled and stepped up the path. The story had begun with greed and a single signature on cheap paper. It had bent into law, into a tiny nonprofit, into a network of volunteers who answered phones at midnight. People often ask if I would do it again. If I'd trade the years of court and sleeplessness for the quiet life I might have had. The answer is no. I would not trade the hard work that taught me how to make paper speak for me. I would not trade the people I met through it or the woman who later called and said, "You saved my house." If you are listening and something about a family interaction smells wrong, trust that scent. Gather paper. Call a lawyer. Find a neighbor who will carry a casserole while you do the hard things. You are not invisible. You have voices around you that can be taught to listen. Subscribe if you enjoyed the story. New stories every day on Revenge Veil.